Hello everyone, my name is Alexis and I am a Year 4 undergraduate from NTU Singapore, majoring in environmental science. For the past 2 years, I've been all over the island surveying what is known as nature ways. And today, I'm proud to present my work, Our Nature Ways in the Way of Nature, which is a project on the effectiveness of Singapore nature ways in supporting invertebrate pollinator biodiversity. To start off, let's talk about what motivated this research project. Tropical ecosystems are the richest terrestrial habitats on Earth, but they are under increasing threats such as land use changes, severe deforestation, habitat degradation, and fragmentation. Southeast Asia has some of the greatest rates of deforestation, and it's predicted it will lose more than 70% of its original forest area by the end of this century. Singapore, nestled in the heart of Southeast Asia, is an extreme case, a so-called recipe for disaster. It has traded its lush jungles for concrete ones, urban development, and national progress, resulting in habitat loss exceeding 96% of land area in under 200 years, and now just 0.2% of our total land area is untouched primary rainforest. Now we have a country with highly fragmented and isolated forest habitats. The natural course of action to remedy this is to connect these spaces, and here we introduce nature ways. The National Parks Board has been implementing nature ways since 1992 to improve ecological connectivity island-wide. On the map, they are the routes seen that are in red. So nature ways are planted up with a curated selection of plants that mimic the natural forest canopy, and so they encourage the movement of animals between our urban parks and nature reserves. Today, our 39 nature ways stretch over 150 kilometers island-wide, and there are plans to double their coverage by 2030. But upon closer inspection, you'll notice that not all nature ways are made equal. They differ in key characteristics like connectivity, urban disturbance, proportion of surrounding natural area, and floral diversity, affecting the animals that will use these corridors. There haven't been any formally published work on their efficacy either, and research into such corridors in Asia especially tend to be quite lacking. Thus, my project seeks to understand how these key characteristics of nature ways contribute to their ability to support invertebrate pollinator biodiversity. By invertebrate pollinators, we mostly mean insects from the orders Lepidoptera and Hymenoptera. The measures of biodiversity investigated will be abundance, species richness, Shannon's diversity index, and the complexity of plant-pollinator interactions. I hypothesized that richer biodiversity areas will be associated with greater connectivity, lower urban disturbance, and greater proportion of surrounding natural area. Increased floral richness will also result in more complex interaction networks between the plants and the pollinators. There were 3 parts to my methodology: the site selection and characterization, followed by the fieldwork, and finally data analysis in R. So I identified 19 1.9 kilometer sites on the nature ways. This map shows the nature way routes in white, and the identified sites are in cyan and yellow. These sites were divided into 3 500-meter transects spaced 200 meters apart, and each transect was characterized according to my chosen study variables. For connectivity and urban disturbance, the transects were assigned into one of 5 levels, each based on satellite imagery and on-site judgment. The proportion of surrounding natural area was calculated with ArcGIS. 200-meter buffer zones, which are the areas seen in white, were drawn around the transects, and then the natural land use areas, which are the areas in green, were loaded in. So the areas in red are the overlapping areas between these natural areas and the buffer zones, and that's the areas that we are interested in. The fieldwork was split into 2 phases. Firstly, the 500-meter transects were walked over 15 minutes, and butterfly species were recorded. Secondly, 100-meter stretches of each transect were surveyed for plant-pollinator interactions. All flowering species were counted and identified, and both the butterflies and bees were recorded when nectaring was observed for this segment. Finally, the data analysis was conducted in R. For the transect data, mixed effect models were built to study how nature way characteristics affected their biodiversity, and a bipartite plot was also made to visualize the plant-pollinator interactions. Finally, it's time to look at our exciting results. Over my many fieldwork sessions, we counted an astounding 1,978 Lepidoptera individuals, representing 52 unique species. Most of them were common urban species, but we did spot some rarer forest specialist types, such as the Great Helen, the big black butterfly you see on the bottom left. And for the transect models, we found that connectivity had no statistically significant effects on abundance, richness, and Shannon's diversity index. Thus, merely increasing the number of physical connections into a nature way did not guarantee increasing usage of nature ways by butterflies. And although not statistically significant, we can see that level 5 connectivity had the highest abundance and species richness, potentially due to that level denoting an overlap with existing natural area. So what we see here may be due to spillover effects. Next, urban disturbance had a statistically significant effect on abundance and species richness. Transects that had the lowest urban disturbance had higher abundances and richness. Notably, 73% of all species recorded were observed in just the 10 transects that were scored level 5. And forest specialists like the Great Helen, the Malay Baron, and other ringed butterflies were exclusive to these transects as well. In comparison, only 34% of the species recorded in the 15 transects with level 1 disturbance were mostly common urban species. This shows how urbanization has an effect on abundance, richness, as well as species compositions. As the proportion of surrounding natural area of transects increased, we also found an increase in the species richness, abundances, and Shannon's diversity index, though only the effect on abundance was statistically significant. This finding may again be due to spillover effects, and species in forested habitats have also been found to disperse further than in urban ones, hence possibly why greater abundances and rarer species were also observed. Moving on, we observed 237 plant-pollinator interactions. These were used to build a bipartite plot, as seen on the left side of the screen. The species names on the left are plants, including both ornamental and roadside wildflowers, and the species on the right are the invertebrate pollinators that were observed visiting these flowers, and they are grouped according to family. Tridex procumbens, although labeled a common roadside weed, attracted the highest diversity and abundance of pollinators. It was even as successful as other planted pollinator-attracting species like Lea rubra and Secchi indica. On the other hand, some commonly planted ornamental plants were actually poor attractors of pollinators despite their abundance. And on the other side of the bipartite plot, we found that butterflies tended to show more general nectaring preferences as they were observed visiting at least a few different flowering species. Meanwhile, bees, other than the Asian honeybee, were observed visiting only a single species. Overall, the floral diversity and composition at each site affected the complexity of plant-pollinator interactions observed. Sites that lacked plantings, or they may have had plants but weren't in bloom, these sites yielded the lowest records of pollinators and visitations. So from these findings, we can make a number of recommendations to improve the state of Singapore's nature ways. Firstly, these thin strips of nature ways need to be enhanced in tandem with the surrounding urban area, as we found that more natural and greener areas harbored greater biodiversity. Secondly, wildflowers like Tridex procumbens and Mimosa pudica and Cinegella nodiflora are actively removed weeds, yet they accounted for more than half of the visitations. Weeding schedules need to be reorganized to strike a balance between maintenance and appeal of the nature ways to our pollinators. Thirdly, based on my observed plant pollinator visitations, we can recommend more attractive species to be planted along nature ways, like Stachytarfeta indica and Lea rubra. Alternatively, butterfly host plants can also be targeted directly to be planted along the nature ways. As nature ways are still a fairly new implementation in Singapore, there is much room for further research and evaluation of their strengths and weaknesses. This project may have quantified pollinator biodiversity inhabiting the nature ways, but it has not tested if they are truly using them to travel between the natural areas. Future studies could employ mark release recapture techniques to track dispersal patterns, and I'm excited that this is actually what I'm working on for my current final year research project. Finally, another limitation was the focus on invertebrate pollinators. Anecdotally speaking, I spotted many avian and mammalian species during my surveys too. So these unsurveyed taxa may also be affected by the different nature way characteristics in different ways. So we have come to the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and please let me know if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis, for the very interesting presentation. If you have any questions, leave them in the Q&A box and we'll go through them now. So I was amazed by the various characteristics you looked at of the nature ways and the large diversity of species you assessed. And I was wondering, like, what was the most surprising discovery you made?
I think for the most surprising discovery, it would have to be the results I found for connectivity. So what we found was that connectivity didn't really have that much effect. Connectivity did not really have that much effect on the biodiversity, but the whole point of the nature waves is to act as an ecological connective network. So we were expecting that there would be more of a gradient, I guess, along these lines. Yeah, but we didn't really observe that. In some areas, which in theory, it should have been a high biodiversity site because it's like right between two high biodiversity areas. We thought those would have high biodiversity, but like when I actually went down to survey them, it was actually quite poor. So we really have to look into other factors that could go beyond the chosen study characteristics in this study to explain these variations in the biodiversity.
Okay. So we're taking more questions. Please leave them in the Q&A box and we'll go through them. So we do have a question from Isabel. She's wondering what you predict the effect of nature waves will have on other animals in Singapore. And do you think it would be similar?
That's a good question. So because along the way, I mean, in general, like I'm someone who likes to nature watch. So while I'm there on my surveys to look out for butterflies and the bees, I was also looking out for birds as well. And I'm thinking that there will definitely be different characteristics that would affect different taxa individually. So for example, for birds, they may not be looking so much at like connectivity because birds have a lot more so-called freedom in terms of being able to fly around. So just connectivity alone may not be able to explain their biodiversity in certain sites. And then for mammals, it could be something else entirely. For mammals, maybe if you're looking at something like squirrels, then they would really have to look out for if there's a suitable habitat area for them, like the trees and everything. So there's a lot of things that will go into explaining these insects. Like even between the butterflies versus the bees, there are also different, there would probably be different factors that affect like whether they can be found in a certain site. So for example, for butterflies, it would mostly, I mean, for butterflies, usually we look out for the host plant. So the plants where the butterflies will actually lay eggs on for the caterpillars to grow on, they actually are quite picky. So if you can't find a host plant in a certain area, you might not find that butterfly species at all. So there's a lot of factors that could be taken into account in studies like these actually.
All right, thank you, Alexis. That was a very interesting presentation. Oh, there is one more question actually. So this is a question from Isabel, and she was wondering, do you think these results would be replicated in other environments, or do you think they will be similar?
I think for the most part, it might be similar for the findings on the urban disturbance area. Because for urban disturbance, I found that when there was increasing urban disturbance, then biodiversity was affected. So there have already been some findings to show how different land use types, you can actually get different levels of biodiversity within these different land use types. So that one probably would be similar even in different environments. But for things like connectivity, those tend to be a bit more complex, and you might actually have to look at the actual like locality of where the study is conducted, and that locality may affect a lot of things in the study.
All right, thank you, Alexis. That was a very interesting presentation.